I'm Mike Magalsky. I'm the founder of infoVia. We're about 4 years old, and I'm going to tell you a story about how we came about, and not only in our consulting practice, because that's how infoVia started, but in how we found this gap in our client base that was, we want to share our data internally and externally, but we can't find a way to do it consistently and safely. And so we ended up building something. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that progression and our journey through the data security space. We've got a few folks here with our team. Tim Krause over here, Mike Kalusik in the back, Jeff Terry right there. And so they'll be around at the end. I think on your way out, we're going to try to scan your badge. So just be aware. And then any questions that you want to direct to them after the fact or me is fine. I put a stack of business cards here if you need one of those. So let's jump right in. So infoVia is our team. Our mission is to bring peace of mind to growing organizations through data management strategies. And that means bringing your data together and integrating it and making sense out of it. But then once you have it all together, then you have this, well, valuable asset that can be attacked, whether willfully or accidentally. That data can be leaked and breached. And so we're here today to talk about specifically the second bullet here, innovative data access and security solutions with what we call InfoSecure. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that as we go on. We're kind of proud of this. A month ago, we filed for a patent on InfoSecure. So Tim helped a lot with that, and that's a big step in our company's progression. Some of the clients we've worked with, we can't advertise all of our clients, but some of them are here. Several local ones, and Micron is mentioned there. We did help take Micron to the cloud in 2019 on their data warehouse side, moving from Teradata to Snowflake. And that's actually kind of a part of the story. I worked at Micron for 24 years, and it was the only job I ever had until I grew up and then started infoVia. And we had some challenges, both on the data quantity side as well as the data security side. And the Chinese actually came right out and said, if Micron won't sell us their IP, we will steal it from them. And so we were right smack dab in the middle of that controversy. Some of the other, what I've learned in the consulting arena is that the volume of your data isn't everything. Size doesn't always matter in the data space. Some healthcare agencies have 9 individuals in the world that have a specific condition. Very tiny data, mostly hand entered, but extremely valuable. It's the lifeblood of those 9 people and anyone else that might follow them with that condition. So it's not always the size, but solutions need to scale from, as I say, 10 to 10 to the 10th power number of rows. And so we found that by working with some of the larger enterprises like General Dynamics, but also down to West Data School District, and making sure that student data and privacy is protected, as well as some colleges on there, some insurance companies, service organizations, and even one financial Connexus Credit Union was our first financial client. So we've kind of touched the gamut, and we found that the same challenges apply to all of them that applied at where InfoSecure originated, where the light bulb came on, I might say. And this is what actually made it happen. Now, this press release you'll notice is in October of 2020 by the U.S. Department of Justice, and but this story goes back to 2016 when this actually happened, because the man in this picture, Stephen Chen, and I met on an elevator in about 2015, I would guess, when we bought their company. He ran a company called RexChip out of Taipei, Taiwan, and we bought their company. Micron integrated them. I was on the mergers and acquisitions team, and this man was their general manager. And we had a chance meeting, and we didn't really have much business with his team. I was on the IT integration team, but I did meet him, and and the people at that site in Asia worship the ground he worked on. He was their fearless leader, and very hierarchical culture, and no one questioned Stephen Chen. So when it turned out in 2015 that Stephen Chen walked out of the office with a laptop full of micron recipes, nobody questioned him. In fact, if you read this article, one of his admins was also implicated in the scam because he told her to hide the evidence. And so what we learned through that, we didn't know who it was that was stealing micron secrets in 2016. This all came out later. But what we found out was that even at the top, there were people that couldn't be trusted with all the data all the time. And here we had it in our data warehouse. We worked very hard for the course of 15 or 18 months to pull all the data together. Jeff was on the team with me there. And we pulled that all together, and now we had somebody exploiting that for various reasons. I said all that to say that there was no solution to this problem that we could find. And we had a very talented security team. JR was the CISO. He was the one that alerted us to the problem. He came in and said, someone is stealing our secrets. Shut down your data warehouse. We had 50,000 users and some critical business and manufacturing operations running against it. He said, shut it down. Because we had no way to turn off a person's, we could turn off one person's access, but we didn't know who it was. We had no way to kind of monitor who was accessing which data. In fact, if you had access to the data warehouse, you could pretty much see anything within it. And that, we realized pretty quickly, had to stop. But we didn't have a way to stop it. We didn't have knobs and dials to turn that down. And so we looked for some solutions, and they just didn't exist. There were some security solutions. Obviously, you could go inside your database and implement row-level security, right? But we had multiple databases. We had our data warehouse, but you can't just lock the front door and expect nobody's going to come in the back door. These are bad people. They'll figure out ways. And as it turned out, Stephen Chen didn't steal the data out of our data warehouse, so that kind of made us feel a little better, not because we accidentally weren't the culprit, but he was stealing it from our MES systems themselves. But in any case, we still had to fix the problem. So we had a pretty talented team there of security analysts, engineers. I was a data architect, and we put our heads together and got in a room, and 10 days later we emerged with a solution that was metadata driven, used views that leveraged the power of the data warehouse itself, the database. So it doesn't have to be a data warehouse. I'll use database and data warehouse kind of interchangeably. But it had to run on multiple technologies. I listed 4 of them here, but really it had to run on anything that we would bring in, because later we replaced Teradata with Snowflake. And so it kind of needed to be platform independent or agnostic. It needed to be performant because some of our queries took minutes or even hours to run. Some of the data science jobs took, they ran all night, and we needed the results in the morning. And so we couldn't slow that down. And so that was a challenge, because all the commercially available products intercepted your query, rewrote your query based on some set of policies, submitted the query, intercepted the results, masked and filtered the results, and then returned them. And on 10 trillion rows, that ain't gonna work, right? It's gonna go to sleep, and a month later wake up. And so we had to make the database aware of the policies so that it could apply them and do what it does best, apply set theory at query time to apply the policies. So this was, in general, our requirements. I'll open it up for any questions or comments so far. Just kind of laid the foundation of the dialogue. Anybody had something similar to this that was a challenge that you had to breach? Okay, well, I'll just keep moving on then. As Changing, a little bit from the Micron story to right around that time, 2018, I started InfoVia. We started working with other clients like healthcare and insurance and education. And we found that the challenges were common, that there was always a need to share data widely, might be within your organization, just the need to share, demographic data, but not necessarily individual PII data, right? For example. And what we found was that there were a lot of solutions out there, but none of them really fully addressed the problem. So none of them were comprehensive, and they were almost always rigid, non-flexible. And over the past 4 to 6 years, when GDPR came out, about 2018, I think that was, there was a lot of reaction to those regulations, and so it needed to be malleable, it needed to be agile, so to speak. And so this need to share data widely was constantly challenged or halted by the changing regulation, compliance requirements, and then the threat of theft and breach. And so we decided that this concept or this approach that we've taken at Micron really had legs in a lot of industries, and that the need to allow for productivity and easy access to your data while still managing the risk and threat was paramount. And we had a solution. We knew that we had implemented something where productivity and risk management could coexist. And so we started introducing it to our clients. We first implemented it in a healthcare situation, and then in an education situation. And each time we would add some capabilities. For example, in the healthcare industry, we realized, well, first of all, it's completely different, obviously, industry than high-tech manufacturing. And so the concepts that needed secured were the 3 Ps, the patient, payer, and provider. And if you applied your security at those levels, then most of the other data in the, we'll say the warehouse, in the database, relates to patient, payer, or provider, or 2 or 3 of those, to a subset of those. And so if you had a diagnosis, for example, well, the diagnosis itself, the fact that somebody has cancer isn't sensitive until you relate it to an individual, right? And so if we could limit the individuals that a given user could see, and then join that data to our diagnosis data, or to our payment data, or to our procedural data, then any of that could also be appropriately managed and secured through the same process. But we had to change our solution. We had to actually make it more generic because there were different set of criteria, or as we call them, categories, classifications of data in that industry. So we made an adjustment. And then we started working in education. And one of the key takeaways in education was this idea that a lot of the data that determines who can see which data is already resident within the metadata of the system itself. In other words, if a student can be seen by the teachers that proctor a class that student is enrolled in, if I'm teaching a student, then I can see that student. Otherwise, I have no business seeing that student and his data, right? Well, that data, you don't need to build a policy from scratch for every student-teacher relationship, because that data already resides within the student-teacher database, right? The system itself. And so we created what we call virtualization of some of our key concepts. And so everything inside the InfoSecure solution can be virtualized. If you have an Active Directory group that tells you what site the person works in, we can attach to that Active Directory group, and then you don't have to manage your site to human relationship within your policies. You just leverage that relationship that already exists. And we found out, well, that scales pretty nicely. A lot of companies use LDAP or Active Directory, and a lot of times there's some pretty key information in there. So let's reuse what we can. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's take advantage of that data that already exists and then virtualize that into our policies. That said, there's still an element of control in the policies where we need to maybe turn them on, like a light switch, right? You turn that policy on or turn it off for a given user or role. And so the virtualization allowed us to have our cake and eat it too, and meet both of those seemingly contradictory requirements. Still hear me all right? Okay. So as the solution developed and we had a few successful implementations under our belt, we would come into a new client, and not always were they as amenable as we thought they should be about this great new idea that we had. And so there had to be a little bit of sales truth applied. So I want to walk through some of the potential security options that we saw people implementing that was somewhat accommodating but not sufficient, okay? The first was to micromanage access to our data. And what I mean by this is to create ECLs in your database for each of your tables, for example. Or sometimes to create views over each of the different combinations or permutations of ways that data could be viewed. So let's say a customer dimension, for example. The level of detail that your customer needs to be presented to a sales engineer is different than the level of detail that needs to be presented to a finance person or an HR person, right? In fact, maybe a manager doesn't need to see detail at all. In the case of the Micron story, it'd have been nice if that general manager just saw aggregate data and not the actual details about how the product was manufactured, because then he would have had to have corroborated with someone else to steal and would have made it less likely to happen. So the level or grain at which people have access to the data, plus the columns and rows that they need access to, if we can control each of those with policies and then overlay those policies on top of one another, now every person in the organization who has an assigned role can see summarized or detailed information. They can see the rows of, like in the student case, a teacher only sees the subset of students. When they query the student dimension, they only see the students that are in the classes that they're teaching and nobody else, because they don't need access to that. And so what we found was that the need to micromanage that was being applied through some kind of archaic means by just taking away full access to tables or views. And not only was that access quite rigid, but the number of views that needed to be accommodated for the permutation of all users and roles, and then types of data and ways that those users and roles can see those types of data, it became unmanageable over time. So we saw that didn't scale. And so that wasn't a viable approach. It at least wasn't sufficient. Oftentimes we saw, similar to creating separate views for the data, we saw BI teams say, oh, we got this. We'll take care of this. We'll just create a new BI report, because it's real easy to create another BI report for the finance team and a different one for the sales team and a different one for the production team. And the reality is, yes, you can spin up the reports, but now somebody has to manage them. And now when your requirements change, you got to make sure that the BI person remembers all the reports that made that security decision and goes and changes those reports, and probably your BI person is sitting around twiddling his thumbs, so something else is not getting done while they're retrofitting their 30 or 40 or 60 or 800 reports. Yeah, we've had clients with 800 reports And retrofitting those is no small task. So the idea would be that you've got a single report that shows customer, a single dimension for student, a single sales transaction fact, and that whoever attaches and runs a query against that select star from customer, they only see the subset that's appropriate for them. And we took it one step further because originally the solution only did row-level filtering, but we realized I might need to see the same students as you, but you don't need to see their phone number or their address. What business does a teacher have seeing the address and phone number of his students? Probably very little. In fact, I've got a story about a teacher that misused that information. So as you can expect, there's a need to manage the column level information as well. So we thought, what if we could apply the same row level filtering policies or similar policies, but apply them to columns as well, and dynamically mask or filter columns. I shouldn't say filter columns, it's mask or obfuscate the data that's in a column, because you don't make a column disappear, you just return null or mask data within that column. And so that's the approach we took, and that eliminated the need for multiple reports that report the same data. Now our clients enjoy a single view of sales transaction that becomes what it needs to for the sales team or the finance team or the HR team. And that allows for the reporting team to create one multi-use artifact that can be displayed to the whole organization, and only the subset of data that any given individual needs would be displayed. The default would be, I'll get you the insight, the default would be to deny access. So if you hire a new person that has no access out of the gate, they could run select star from customer, they'd see no rows until they were granted a role that allowed them access to specific data elements at the row and column level.
Wouldn't that potentially lead to a situation where somebody might be missing information and not know they're missing information?
Yeah, absolutely. That's always a risk.
And how would you troubleshoot that?
So one way that you troubleshoot it would be by allowing for summarized data and detailed data to be displayed, and then compare the difference. We can count the rows that you're not allowed to see and show that on the report. But I would say that is probably one of the stronger criticisms of this approach, is the data disappears without you knowing that it's not there. And so you kind of have to be aware of that. It has to be a part of the mentality from the consumer that I'm seeing my view of this universe, and it might not be completely comprehensive in that regard. There is the concept of, this is kind of along that lines, but have you heard the term disaggregate information identification? Does that come up? I see a couple of head nods. That's the concept of providing summarized information, usually publicly, where a user could reasonably reverse engineer the individual components that made up that aggregate information. And it usually happens, it's the highest risk when there's a subpopulation with just a few members. My kids, I hate to use race as an example, but this is a perfect example. My kids go to a high school, there's only a few black students in their high school. It's just the reality. So if you give grade data based on race, you're singling out the very few students that that are of that race. And so someone could very reasonably make an assumption, especially if you further drill down into male and female. Sometimes you could drill down to a single individual in that school just by what would otherwise seem like it's pretty innocuous data. But we ran into that at the school district when implementing security there, and the need to, and at the healthcare space as well, where there's a need to elevate the security on a population when that population subset falls below a specific threshold. All right, back to common solutions that actually don't really work. Manually extracting and circulating. This is the default go-to solution for every organization that hasn't done it, that hasn't had their data presented publicly or disseminated widespread. They always think, well, why don't we just build an extract? Why don't we just extract it into Excel and email it to whomever? And yeah, that can work, but I tell you, if it's being done manually, there's going to be a day when somebody accidentally sends his data to her in email, and now you have a breach. And if you're a public organization or a financial organization or a healthcare organization, that's going to hit the newspaper. And so don't put charge of managing data sets in the hands of people. People make mistakes. If you're assigning that responsibility to an individual, you're setting yourself up for failure, because there will be a day when they're under pressure and they will make a mistake. It can be automated to an extent, but still you have sets of data circulating around in the atmosphere between email and OneDrive and Dropbox and so on. And so it's better, what we found, it's better to pull instead of push. Give the user access to a portal of sorts. It can be a very lightweight portal. Log in, identify yourself, and run your query. And now, because that query is dynamically producing a data set for that particular individual, then it's safe for them to run a select star from table or joining several tables together through your reporting interface or through an application or even ad hoc queries. Since this solution is applied at the database level, then ad hoc queries operate the same way as queries running through any application or BI layer. So please stop extracting, especially if it's being done manually and circulating that way. And then finally, inadequate technologies. And I'm going to pick on Snowflake because it's becoming very popular. How many are Snowflake users? Just curious out of the group. Nobody wants to admit it. There's one. Okay. Snowflake, I'm a fan. We've seen no clients move to Snowflake and regret it. We've seen no one move away. In fact, I've not even heard of someone, an organization that moved to it. So if you know of one, let me know, and I'll stop making that claim. But it's a pretty, there's a reason for their success. And as far as security goes, and as far as scalability, and just ease of management and automatic tuning, those make it a very compelling solution. And Snowflake has has well thought out security. Ken Graziano, who used to be there, he just retired. He was their chief evangelist. Is a friend of mine, and he tried to recruit me. He and I worked together to bring Snowflake to Micron, and we had to convince some legal and compliance officers that it was safe enough, right? And so they're solid. They have a really, really good security platform. But here's what they don't do. It doesn't apply on SQL Server. It doesn't apply on Oracle. It doesn't apply on Redshift, right? So if you're going to implement Snowflake security, you're going to also have to do the same thing on your backbone. And so we advocate for to avoid the temptation of just using what the database gives you. Interesting side note, one of our clients said, well, there's no way you could possibly, they were on SQL Server, on-prem, they said, well, there's no way you could possibly outperform SQL Server row-level security. And I said, yeah, I think you're right. I wouldn't take that bet that we could outperform it. I said, but it'd be interesting, so let's try it. So they had a DBA and a pretty talented architect, and they built a solution with SQL Server row-level security. One thing they couldn't do is column-level security, which we could, but we just said, okay, let's just take that basic use case and let's put the two together. Let's run a query and let's capture the I/O and CPU microseconds, and we did, and it was a dead heat, which I was pleasantly surprised by that. The fact is, it's set theory, and there's no magic. It's just science and math, and so we were surprised, but yet not surprised that the InfoSecure approach could perform as well as the native approach in that one use case. I won't claim that it was comprehensive and all-encompassing in its reach, because it wasn't, but it was at least confirming to me that when you give the optimizer what it needs to know in terms of which users are in which roles, and which roles can see which subsets of data, it can use that information to build an optimized query that can return that at query time. And what we found is that it oftentimes improves the performance of the queries. So when we put the policies within the relational database, the optimizer can use that information to say, Joe Smith has access to only 13% of the rows, so we're going to use that index and we're going to give him his data faster than if the security policy had not been applied. And so it's not in every case that it speeds up the solutions, but it is in every case that we've found that it's tunable. And so if you identify where there's an opportunity to speed up a query, Snowflake does it automatically with its automatic tuning capabilities. But in SQL Server, you can add indexes and so on. Obviously, if you're screening against the student ID and the student ID isn't indexed, that's not going to help you a lot, but you can add that index and then it will perform faster. So, a little story. I decided I was going to bake a birthday cake for my wife, and we didn't have enough flour, so I thought, well, I'll just add flour later. And my wife wasn't that impressed. So, yeah, the cake is not near as good if you just put the flour on top after you bake it. So I say this to say, when is the appropriate time to attack the data security problem? Can you back in? Can you back in? I've already built my data warehouse. Can I apply InfoSecure, the approach that we've been talking about, late in the process? Well, yes, you can. But if the cat's out of the bag and your users already have access to select star from, and they see all the students, and now you take away 80% of the students because they shouldn't have had access to them in the first place, now you have a change management issue. And users remember when we take things away from them. They love us when we give them new things. They hate us when we take things away. And so if we can put the flour in the cake while we're baking the cake, the users are going to appreciate the end result much better. And so we advocate that, and it's always hard to convince a CIO of this. It's a little easier to convince a CISO, but a CIO has a lot of things on his plate. But to convince them to tackle security while they're building their data warehouse, which can seem like a monumental effort, or while they're integrating data between two ERP systems, those monumental efforts take all hands on deck. And so there's very little bandwidth to take on a security initiative. And it feels like it has to be hard, I guess, difficult. And I think we've proven now, hopefully I've helped convince you, but we've proven with real actual use cases that it doesn't take days, it doesn't take months or years to figure this out. In fact, it can take just days. This is a typical timeline that we've shared with some of our clients and been able to execute well within this. First of all, we take an iterative approach. So you don't have to create all your security policies out of the gate. Tackle the low-hanging fruit first. And let's build a unified, secure view of customer, if that's your immediate need. And let's iterate, let's show the capabilities, and the light bulb will come on to your team, and they'll say, oh, well, if you did that for customer, could you do that for product as well? Well, sure we could. Okay, let's iterate, and let's do that for product. New York University called us up one Tuesday evening in September and said, tomorrow our CEO is making a decision on data security for the new data warehouse. And we're wondering, you make a pretty compelling case, but we kind of want to see it in our environment. Could you do that? I said, it's like 4 p.m. on a Friday, or on a Tuesday, and you want this tomorrow? Well, yeah, we can do that. So I stayed up late. They gave me they're on Snowflake, they gave me a Snowflake login, and we implemented InfoSecure, demoed InfoSecure in their environment, on their data warehouse, to their CDO the next day. So it can be set up extremely quickly. It's just tables, views, and joins. So the solution is simple and fast. Now, teaching the team how to best manage and build best practices about how to build policies is a learning process, right? And this is really a mentality as well. There's a you don't almost have to like drink the Kool-Aid or put the tinfoil hat on to understand or to understand the concept. So we take them through a learning process, and that's what can take a couple weeks and a few iterations. But the basic capability can happen quickly. I said I often use the data warehouse or the database interchangeably. This is just to show that InfoSecure, we call them meta policies because they're policies that are in metadata. So you can report to your auditors what your security policies are, which they love, by the way. Those meta policies can be replicated to any or all of your platforms, whether on-prem or in the cloud. And the secure views then allow for a virtual separator or curtain between your users and all the different ways your users consume data. They're all pulled through those secure views so that at query time, each user sees only what is necessary for that user. And the policies can be adjusted in real time. So if you decide that that HR manager does need to see phone numbers, you change the policy, and the next time she runs the query, whether it's through an application or a machine learning model or a BI tool or even ad hoc SQL. See, most solutions in this space don't work on the latter. And if you've got a savvy data user, they're just going to go around your BI tool and run some direct queries. A database level security solution such as InfoSecure works on ad hoc SQL as well. So you make the change, the HR director 3 seconds later runs the query again, and now she sees phone numbers. So the modern solution uses intuitive, reusable user access points. They're just views. They're just data objects in your database. If you use ODBC or JDBC or any other connection mechanism, it still recognizes that. It doesn't. You don't have to retrain your user community. You just point them to the secure views and take away their access to the other things. Hopefully, if you've baked it into the cake, you're not taking away anything. You're just granting them access to the layer that has security implemented. It uses meta policies so that your access governance is malleable and agile, you might say, so that it can conform to changing regulations and requirements. It is configurable. There's a low-code approach. The views are generated SQL code, but our newest version of InfoSecure UI generates those with the use of metadata. So nobody has to write them. They're generated and deployed to your environment. We've talked about the technology agnostic approach. We do have a use case where one of our clients moved from on-prem to the cloud. We lifted and shifted their policies, recreated the views, and it just worked. There was no unwinding of security on platform X and rewinding that security up on platform Y and all the testing and validation that had to happen there. Of course, there was testing and validation, but it just worked. And then finally, there is what we call cell-level enforcement. So the fact that you can take row-level security policies and column-level security policies, overlay them with each other. You can actually manage who can see individual cells within the data if you need to take policies to that level. All right, I'm gonna stop there and I guess open it up for any challengers maybe. Somebody might be sitting out there going, I appreciate the question earlier. So what about this? Any ideas or thoughts come to mind? This is your opportunity to throw Rotten Tomatoes and be a naysayer.
Yeah. Just as a general thing, when you say meta policy, that's just another way of saying RBAC, right? You're making role-based access control.
Sort of. I think we take it another step further. We create user-to-role associations, and then we associate roles to data components. And those data components can be at the row level or the column level, or even combinations thereof.
So, what's your ultimate source of truth? Is it within your application, or say, you mentioned SQL, for instance. Say you've got SQL that's deployed in Azure AD. I mean, most of the access is controlled by Active Directory accounts and roles. I mean, how does that map?
Yeah. So if you have Active Directory assigning roles, then we can leverage or reuse that through the virtualization capabilities I talked about. But we still would need some metadata to map those roles to the actual rows and columns of data that are allowed to see it. And when I say columns, it can even be role. The admin role can see clear text in that column. The viewer role can see masked text, maybe the first two characters, or the last four of the social, or the first two of the zip code, or whatever. And then there might be another role that has no business seeing any of that data, so they see null in that column, or any variation of those. So that mapping of the role, which would be defined in Active Directory or LDAP, to the data that they can actually see, that would need to be maintained in what's called these metadata policies, or meta policies. It's just a simple mapping of the role. We can also map individuals to policies, but that's kind of an exception case. I can talk about that in a second. But mapping the user to the role, which might be already done, and we would just leverage that. But then mapping that role to the data elements, namely role identifiers or column identifiers that can be seen, because by default you're denied access. So we map those to the elements that individual can or is allowed to see. So it's similar to RBAC, but it's a whole finer grain. Okay, good question. I'll talk about the exception. Parents can see student data, right? Until the student turns 18, in which case they can revoke their data, their parents' data. Did you know that? I found that out. My son turned 18 and he had to give me access to see his grades. And then you have parents who are under court order not to see. So in both those cases, you have an exception. So we have a new capability in InfoSecure. We need these exception scenarios because that's weird. Why would a parent not be allowed to see their kid? Well, there's a rule when the kid turns 18, then the parents aren't by default allowed. They need to be explicitly granted access. And if they have a court order against them, they need to be explicitly revoked access. So we have default deny Then we have explicit allow, and then exception disallow or deny access. So all three layers work together to produce the end result set from the data set to the end user that's asking. Any other questions? All right.
Did you have any kickback from any of your customers in regards to the structure that you were trying to initiate?
No. We had one of them ask us, so you're a pretty young company, and we need some assurance that you're not going to go away and leave us without a solution. And our answer, I think, will answer your question. First of all, we deploy our solution as tables, views, and joins inside of your database platform. You own it. We don't. We're not software as a solution. We deploy our solution inside your database, and then we keep our dirty hands off of it. So you own it. It's going to work forever. But our UI, if you choose to use our UI or our API, you don't have to, because it's just metadata tables in your database. You can manage them through SQL scripts if you wanted. But if you use our API and UI, which we recommend you do, because there's some like the code generation capabilities that we talked about, there's some nice features in it. Then how about this? How about we give our lawyers the key to our GitHub account, and if we go defunct, you get that key. That's perfect. So it was a 2-sentence legal description in our software licensing agreement. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anybody have a fun use case that you want to throw out there? Any special data security requirement that's been challenging in your environment, whether you've solved it or not?
Oracle.
Okay.
So we use a large ERP type software in the aviation industry called Covo that runs on Oracle.
Okay.
Which is a rather expensive product to begin with. Unfortunately, the only access we have to that database is read only. We can't write back to it except through the client or with a paid service through an API. So, for example, the way our security permissions are set up, we delegated it to groups a couple of years ago because we had 20 system admins in there. Why that occurred was before my time. We locked it all back down. We took a lot away. Like you said, we took a lot